Hey everybody, how's it going? So if you have been paying attention to my personal Facebook page, um, you'll notice that I've been doing like a series of posts about hell. And so as a result of that, a friend of mine who's been following some of that, asked me if I would go over a particular parable. So that's what I want to do today. But also, it's interesting if you're a listener to the podcast, to Crisis of Faith. Just today, the day that I'm making this video, anyway, we dropped the first episode on the podcast in a series about the teachings of Jesus. So that's kind of cool. And then just last night at my church, I was in my weekly Bible study. I had scheduled this out a long time ago, long before Stacy asked for me to go over this parable about hell. We did this one last night. So a lot of kind of cool synchronicity there. Folks might be interested in this for different reasons. So anyhow, I want to look at the parable of the wheat and the weeds in Matthew 13. And particularly what that says, or might not say about hell. So let me just open that up. Okay, so this is in Matthew 13. Verses 24 to 30, and then a little later there's actually it's one of these rare parables where we get an explanation of the parable, and that's a little removed from the parable itself, which we'll say something about in a moment. Anyhow, here it is. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" He answered, "An enemy has done this." The slaves said to him, "Then do you want us to go and gather them?" Gather the weeds, that is. But he replied, "No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first, bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." Okay, and then there's a little bit of a break, and down to verse 36. Then he left the crowds, and Jesus, left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples appeared to him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." So here comes the explanation. "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seeds are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let everyone who has ears listen." Okay, so it's an interesting parable, right? I want to say 4 things about it. The first is just kind of a disclaimer, and then the other 3 are about what this parable might say with regard to hell. Okay, so first, notice the structure of the parable. It's interesting, right? There's the parable, and then there's some stuff in the middle, and then the explanation of the parable. So it kind of makes a sandwich around the stuff in the middle. This is a really common structure for the gospel writers to use. And generally, it's intentional, right? The gospel writers are smart guys or gals, and they write things in such a way that you're supposed to pay attention to where they show up in the gospel. And so we're supposed to understand this parable in light of the stuff in the middle, and we're supposed to understand the stuff in the middle, the meat, in light of the bread, and the bread in light of the meat, right? To follow the sandwich analogy. So what's in the middle? Well, there's one thing about how Jesus teaches in parables. He's always talking in parables. It says, because he is going to reveal things that have been hidden, and the word there is crypto, hidden, since the foundation of the world. Okay. And then there's two other short parables. One is about the parable of the mustard seed that you all know, right? You take a small little mustard seed and it grows in the garden. It's so small, it's like it's hidden, right? But it grows and it takes over your garden. In fact, mustard in the ancient world was a weed. It wasn't something that was produced for its fruits. It takes over your garden like kudzu. And in fact, it seems like a bit of a parody parable. In the prophets, you often hear about what we're calling, what the Gospels call the kingdom of God, but they might say, the age to come. They talk about the great tall cedars of Lebanon, this mighty, majestic trees, and the eagles build their nests in them. Right. And so Jesus tells this kind of parody parable where he says the kingdom of God, it's like a weed that takes over your garden, and the birds of the air, the crows, the kind of carrion birds, come and nest in them. It says it's weird because it's like the weeds are the good thing. The weed is the image in this parable. The weed is the image of the kingdom. And then there's this other parable about a woman who takes yeast and hides it, crypto, in some flour, in some wheat. And it says the kingdom of God is like that. It spreads through the dough. So here, the thing hiding in the wheat, and remember, yeast is not a good thing. Yeast is a symbol of sin. It's the thing that you remove from your house for the holy days. And it's the thing hiding among the wheat that is the good thing, which is totally different from how you would expect to read this parable, right? It sure sounds like in both the parable itself and in the description that the wheat is what you want and that there's some bad weeds hiding in among it. But all of the stuff in the middle is the opposite of what you're supposed to think about this parable, which means the structure of the parable is such that Matthew wants us to go, wait, hold on. Am I getting this right? Matthew wants us to slow down and pay attention to this parable, and perhaps to even ask us to read it humbly, to temper our expectations about what we hear in it. So that's just a disclaimer. I don't know what any of that means. I just want to start with that. Okay, but now some more specific things about what this might say about hell. So if you come to this parable with a sort of medieval Gothic picture of hell in your mind, right? The devil in red tights, and there's flames, and there's torments. People are eternally and consciously tormented in the hellfires. Then we think, okay, well, this makes sense, right? People are weeping and gnashing their teeth in pain while they burn in hellfire for all of eternity, right? But I don't think that's what's actually going on. I think there are actually two metaphors happening here in this parable. There's the weeds being thrown into the fire. That's one metaphor. And the weeping and gnashing of teeth. So gnashing of teeth is actually a phrase that's used throughout the Bible, and it never, in any instance, indicates pain. Rather, it's a picture of anger. So let me just give you a couple of examples. In Acts, when Stephen is being stoned to death, in the middle of being stoned, he gives this big speech that those who are stoning him murdered the prophets, right? And so they get upset about this and they gnash their teeth at him. Also, Job says that God gnashes God's teeth at Job. God is angry at Job and so gnashes his teeth at him, gnashes God's teeth at him. So it's a picture of anger. Aside from this parable that we're dealing with today, the phrase weeping and gnashing of teeth is used 5 times in the Gospels. 3 of those 5 times, it represents anger about being excluded from a banquet. And it's never, in no instance, is this phrase, weeping and gnashing of teeth, associated with hellfire or fire of any kind. In fact, 3 out of the 5 passages in which it's used, it's explicitly disassociated with fire because it's in darkness. So, weeping and gnashing of teeth is a metaphor for exclusion or discernment, right? It's about who or what is in and who or what is out. And of course, the weeds separated from the wheat is also this kind of metaphor of discernment. You know, which one is the weed and which one is the good crop. So in that second metaphor, the weed and the weeds, the furnace is just where you toss the wheat, right? It's not, there's no reason to think that it's supposed to be a description of an afterlife. You know, people who hear that the weeds go into the fire, they say, oh, yes, there it is. See, hell is eternal fire. But where does the wheat go in that story? Well, it goes into the barn. And I've never heard anybody say, you see, heaven is a great barn in the sky. Interesting. Okay. Third thing I want to raise is really more of a question that I'm raising for people smarter than I am, because it pushes the limits of my very limited knowledge of Greek. So, in the explanation part of the parable, just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom panta ta scandala, everything that causes scandal, and tous poiuntas tein anomeon, and they will throw them into the furnace. That second phrase, tous poiuntas te anomion, is an adjectival phrase, a substantive predicate, right? It's literally, like, the words on the page are the making lawlessness. So the way these phrases work in Greek is that you have to just supply the agent. It's something like the making lawlessness ones, or those who make lawlessness. That's why the NRSV renders it just evildoers, or the English Standard Version is probably closer with lawbreakers. Okay, but here's my point. I'm not sure that you couldn't just as well supply a non-personal agent, those things which make lawlessness. This would make it parallel to the prior phrase, everything that causes scandal, or all the scandalous things. Now, I've been accused in these Facebook posts of cooking the books, of trying to manipulate people by, intentionally reading the text wrong, which is not what I'm trying to do. So in the interest of intellectual honesty here, I just want to make it very clear that because this phrase is masculine and not neuter, that might mean that you have to supply a personal agent. I'd really love for somebody who knows Greek better than I do to tell me if that's the case. And since every English translation that I consulted did supply a personal agent here, I will err on the side of caution. So I'm just raising this as a question. Suppose you could translate this with a non-personal agent. Then what gets thrown into the fire? Everything scandalous and those things which make lawlessness. You know, James, Jesus' brother, when he talks about what great damage that we can do with our words, he says that the tongue is a fire set ablaze by Gehenna. Right? In other words, hellfire, James says, is something that's inside of me. So maybe the line between the wheat and the weeds, between the righteous and the wicked, doesn't run between us and them, but runs right down the center of each of us. Maybe all the scandalous things and those things that make lawlessness are things inside of me that need to be burned up. Anyway, as I said, that's somewhat speculative. So before I make a fourth point, let's just assume that not only this third point is incorrect, we can assume really that my whole argument up to this point has been invalid. So let's say that this parable is exactly what meets the eye, despite the fact that Matthew seems to deliberately make us kind of second guess it. And let's say that the furnace is the fire of hell, even though there's no indication that it's less metaphorical than the barn. And let's say that the things being tossed into the furnace are not parts of ourselves, but they're whole persons. They're lawbreakers. There's still, this is the fourth point, there's still absolutely nothing in this passage to suggest that the weeds, or the makers of lawlessness, are not just burned up, rather than consciously being tormented forever. So even if you consider the gnashing of teeth, you've got passages like Psalm 112 that says, when the righteous are exalted, the wicked see it, and they are angry. They gnash their teeth and melt away. They're gone forever. So how can you read this parable? You can read it with the structure in which Matthew places it in mind and say, well, I don't know what the hell it's supposed to mean. I think in some ways that's the way Matthew leads us to be honest. You can read it as an apocalyptic prophecy that teaches the total annihilation of the wicked. They're burned up. The lawless are burned up and they're gone forever. I think this is probably the most straightforward and obvious reading of the parable. You could possibly read it as wisdom teaching about what my soul needs to have burned away from itself at the end of the age. But there's simply no responsible way that you can read this parable as an image of eternal conscious torment. All right, that's all. Thanks a lot for sticking out that kind of long explanation. Take care, guys.